Hello everyone, happy Friday and welcome to Frequently Asked Questions about Beekeeping, episode 26. Today is Friday, July 19th. And this is information for beginning beekeepers, and these are based on questions that were submitted by viewers over the past week. Thank you for those of you who are coming back. If you're brand new and you want to know what we're going to talk about today, please look down in the video description and you'll see line items that show what topics we're going to cover. And of course, we're in the middle of a heat wave here in the northeastern United States, and it's going to be one hot weekend. So I hope you're ready for that. It's 89 degrees Fahrenheit right here, and as you can see in the beginning of the sequence here, it's been raining. It's very hot, and thank goodness though we have cloud cover, but the humidity is ridiculous. So I hope wherever you are, you're finding ways to keep yourself and your honeybees cool. Lots of fresh water. Don't forget your sea salts, 1 teaspoon per quart to fresh water there, and help them stay dry and stay mineralized. So it's pretty good. Anyway, we're going to jump right into it, and we'll start with Bill Baskin's question. Right now I have 7 or 8 frames between 3 hives that are at 50 to 75% capped with nectar in the remainder. What to do with this honey? These frames are going into the heart of summer. So here's the thing this time of year, and particularly for those of you, this may be your first year keeping bees, and you can get really excited about wanting to show everyone that your bees paid off. You have honey and you have jars full of it, and you want to get that honey off of there and share with everybody. I caution you to wait. I'm not saying that Bill is starting off here. I'm not saying that this is his first time around, but sometimes we pull honey too soon when you're new in particular. And then you don't leave the bees anything for the summer dearth. So depending on where you are in the United States, or in the world for that matter, midsummer often brings a dearth, which means there's no nectar or pollen coming in sufficient quantity to sustain the population of your hive. And that's when they turn to the resources that are stored in the hive body: pollen and stored honey. So if you pull it off too soon, they won't have it. If you go into a dearth, and what happens then? It kicks off robbing. And when the bees head out and they can't find the resources they need from the environment, they look to other weaker colonies of bees and they move in and rob them out. Bees are the prime target because they have the exact resources that the other bees want and need, and it can happen very fast. So I encourage you to make sure that your entrance reducers are adequate for them to defend, not wide open. You have a tendency to want to open our hives wide open because it's hot and allow them to cool. Bees cool themselves very well, even with moderate-sized openings. So don't fall for that. So my advice to Bill is leave it on and wait until the next nectar flow really kicks in, and then as they, top off, you can pull them off. Like my flow supers are all on right now, and they are at 70-75%, but I also know that as they fill up, and if we go into a dearth or extended periods of rain, for example, the bees may draw that back out as they keep their brood going. And especially critical right now is the pollen resources. So I recommend that you leave it on, and if you're really concerned about being honeybound is when they start putting in so much honey there's no room for the queen to lay her eggs. I recommend adding another super just to give them a little extra space whether they use it or not. So that's what I would do there. Leave it until the dearth is over. Next one is from Wendy Bachman. What are the determining factors to differentiate a spotty breed pattern from normal hygienic behavior? It's a brood pattern. I'm sorry, I said breed pattern. When it comes to the brood frames in your hive, you should see consistent blocks of capped brood when they're at their final stage, when they're pupa. And if that seems sporadic and there's little bits and pieces of capped brood all over the place, that's signs of a failing queen, a queen that's not laying a solid pattern. The best queens, we know, will lay solid patterns, usually in a radius shape, and they start in the center and move their way out. And as you get to the extremity, those capped brood may be 21 days old, so the other brood in the middle would have hatched and come out. So when you see nice clean blocks of hatched sections in your brood frames, look in there to see if there are eggs. If there's eggs, there's nothing wrong with the queen. That's just a natural hatching pattern. But if the queen starts to lay here and there, and they're little covered cells for the pupae that are kind of spread and not connected to one another in groups where the nurse bees can take the best care of them, then that's signs that your queen might be in trouble. And the difference is, she mentioned the hygienic behaviors. Hygienic bees, like those that I keep, survivor line bees from the weaver family, and this year we're experimenting with the Saskatraz bees. They determine when some of the developing brood and larvae may be sick or not up to speed for what they want for their colonies, so they'll actually drag them out and discard those from the hive. And that looks like a spotty queen at times, but what's really happened is the hygienic bees have uncapped those cells themselves and gotten rid of the contents. How would you know the difference? Well, if you get out before sunrise and looked at your landing boards on your hives, if you see different stages of development of bees laying dead on your landing boards, larvae, pupae that have been pulled from their cells, they have eyes and all the limbs and everything are there, there's a very good chance that your bees are behaving hygienically to a threat within the hive. And that could be varroa, that could be some other sickness in the hive, and they're cleaning it out and doing what they're supposed to do. And that's why sometimes you may see patches of cleared out brood, and that's not necessarily because of the queen. So know those differences. Now, as long as the patterns, if she's laying in good collections where they're next to one another, a few openings in there is not the end of the world. But as long as she's laying in groups, I consider that to be a good queen, and I wouldn't do anything about it. If they're spotty and she's failing, there's a very good chance you're already going to see drone increase, and you're also going to see possibly some supersedure cells or swarm cells. Supersedure cells are in the middle of the field of the brood, and you'll see the little peanut come off of there, and it's like they're sagging down. And that's often because the bees recognize that their queen is not laying well, and it's generally what you're going to find if it's not an example of hygienic behavior, but rather a queen that is starting to fall off in her egg laying. And in an attempt to salvage the colony, they of course create a new queen from open brood. So if your queen is still laying in clusters, I think that she's still good to keep. I wouldn't be that concerned about it. If you find broad sections of your brood frames that are open and available and the queen is not laying eggs in there, and the resources are available. So that's the other end of it. You have to watch out for your brood frames. The queen may back off if you're in a summer dearth and there isn't enough pollen coming in, for example. They can't raise larvae. They cannot raise baby bees if they have no pollen to feed them and from which to make royal jelly to get them started when they hatch from eggs at their third day. So know those differences, pay attention to the environment, and don't panic. If there's plenty of populated bees in your hive and the brood frames are loaded with bees and you have more capped brood than not, I think you're good to go. And when you look at those unoccupied cells, which you perceive to be unoccupied cells, look carefully to see if there aren't eggs already in them. Your queen may be just doing fine. If not, you might have to replace them or allow the bees to replace the queen themselves. If there's open brood, they have the possibility of doing that. If you don't see eggs, you don't see open brood, and there's evidence that the queen is not laying, it's time to order in a new queen before too much time has passed. You can get a queen in 3 to 4 days through first-class mail, and you can put her in and she'll be fertile and ready to lay. So determine if you even have a queen kicking. So thank you for that. And why are some brood caps darker than others? So when you look at the brood frames, and in my hives, the lowest frames are the oldest, and they are often the darkest darkest comb. So when you see the comb, sometimes it's really dark, almost black. Whenever there are brood being reared there, and when you see them finally cap over for the pupa stage, then you'll notice that those caps can be very dark brown, and then you go up another frame, and there's brood in there as well, and then you see that those caps are a nice light cinnamon color. Why the cap difference? Well, because the bees are going to draw upon the comb wax itself, as well as amending that while they make those pupa caps. And when they do that, if they're drawing on cells that are of old material and it's darker, then also the capping is going to be darker. And the newer frames with newer drawn out comb, it's a light tan, so therefore the caps are also a light tan. That's a really good question and a neat observation that somebody else made when they were looking at my observation hive over this past week, that the caps are different, and that's because of the age of the comb on the frame itself. And if you had a brand new frame with brand new comb and they're going to pull that out and they finally get larvae to develop in there and then they're capping off the brood, those would be very light tan color, and that's because the comb would be brand new. So they're recycling some of the wax and they're amending new wax to it. So that's why that happens, and that's why sometimes brood looks different in shade, especially frame by frame? That's a very good question. What kind of plants should we be planting this time of year for the bees? Is it too late to plant seeds? Okay, I'm starting seeds myself. So right now I have swamp milkweed seeds that are started in a biodome. And I'm reviewing that product, so I'm going to show the biodome later, probably later this week even, so if you want to see that. But as far as putting plants in the ground, we're in July here. It's super hot. Generally, it's dry this time of year, but we have rain. So all my plants are doing really well. One of the things, though, that I want you to notice in your specific area, we are midsummer here. So what kind of things would be providing? This could potentially be a summer dearth period where the bees would not be able to get the nectar and the protein resources they need in pollen from the environment. But if you go to a big garden center, and about 40 minutes from where I live, there is a nice big garden center that has several acres of offerings, and we were just there a few days ago. And walking around and looking at the plants, what's the advantage to going there right now? Well, the trees that are flowering, the shrubs that are flowering, and then of course the potted flowers that they have there, you can see right then outside which ones are attracting bees and pollinators. And some of them we went to and they were loaded with orchard bees. They had bumblebees on them. I didn't notice any honeybees, but what we did see was evidence that they were providing a lot of nectar. So one was a shrub, a honeysuckle shrub that only grows 3 to 4 feet tall and spreads 3 to 4 feet. So we bought 4 of them because we could see that right now when a lot of other things are not in bloom, they are loaded with nectar and the bees are all over them. The other thing was we found some cone flowers. Got those too, and it's a great time to look at the linden trees. There were linden trees that still had flowers on them. So the American linden, it's actually a basswood tree, and the linden would be Tilia americana. So now looking at the trees in the lineup of the trees that they had that they were selling there, some of the linden trees did not have flowers on them, some did. So it's a great time to see which ones will be flowering this time of year. So again, go to your garden center and look around and see what the bees are on in the open air at the garden center, and you'll know what's going to bloom this time of year. There's no guesswork. Bring them home, dig the holes, plant them, water them in, and you're good to go. So we created another hedge of now nectar resources for the bees. So it's a great time of year to look at that. You can start seeds, but seeds are difficult. They won't flower generally this time of year. The swamp milkweed that I'm planting and demonstrating the biodome with, they will not flower this year, but I am going to be able to kick off the root systems that will continue through winter, even when the plant above ground dies off. And that will kick off a nice strong crop of those swamp milkweeds because I have a very wet area in one field that I'd like to see turned into a milkweed resource for all the pollinators. So that's a great question, great time of year to do that. This one is from One Old Curmudgeon. I have noticed that in the evening, they are congregating on the landing board in complete darkness. They aren't fanning, just clustered. Is this common? It absolutely is common, especially during the summertime. In the summertime, what's going on in the hive? We have a lot of heat buildup in there, and if we have a population in the hive that's maxed too, when you look at your frames and they're just covered in bees, every bee, just like a room full of people, they're all perspiring, they're talking, they're respirating. We're putting moisture into the air, and if you're trying to cool down, ventilate, and dry out that air, which the bees are trying to do because they're bringing in nectar like crazy right now. So they're trying to dehydrate the nectar down to a final honey consistency under 20% water. And so those bees are in the way. The foragers are just impeding that progress because there's more bees that they have to move the air around. So the foragers instead move outside, they mass on the front of the hive, and they even do what's called bearding, where they might be hanging off the bottom of the hive and forming a beard shape, a dark mass of bees, and they're just hanging there just the way this question described it. So that's perfectly normal, and you're going to see them out there at night too until it cools off, especially hot days like this. And we put those hive visors out, and they created shade, and now the bees congregate just under the hive visors, and they're staying dry from rain, they're staying out of direct sunlight, and it gives them a chance to rest while inside the hive. The bees are working very hard. If you look at the entrance of your hive and listen, it's going to sound like somebody turned a dryer vent on because it is really, they're really circulating air in a very efficient way, and those other bees are just in the way, so they push them outside, and that's where they wait. Now, if it gets really cold at night for some reason, which, where I live right now, that's not going to happen. But if it does get cold at night, then they will migrate back inside the hive, including if a heavy rainstorm, for example, hit and they didn't feel protected, they would move in. If you don't have some kind of visor on the front of your hive and instead you've got the roof of the hive or some kind of overhang or a telescoping cover, the bees that are massed on the front will also move up and just collect underneath that lip, and that's also why they collect underneath the landing board and form a beard. So it's absolutely normal. It doesn't, it just means they're getting out of the way for those that are cooling and ventilating the colony and circulating air over that brood, and we want those numbers to stay strong because we're about to go into a major nectar flow at the end of summer. So for me, the next major pollen hit is going to be the sunflowers. I have thousands of sunflowers I planted this year. Maximilian sunflowers will be the last to bloom. They'll go right into the end of the summer, and we will have asters, and we'll have goldenrod, and all that will kick in. And right now, filling the gap is also the white clover that's everywhere. And there's something called dogbane. Dogbane is really blossoming right now, and it's full of nectar, and the bees are on it, and I have a whole field of it. I didn't even know what that was until this morning. I thought it was some kind of strange thin-legged milkweed, but it's not. It's dogbane. I think it's called spreading dogbane. Really interesting stuff. Put a video up here so you can see what that looks like. And next, Sean Brown. I live in Los Angeles. I really want to become a beekeeper. My concern is closeness to my neighbors, some of which have small children. This applies to anybody that lives in any town in the United States. If you're living in a congested living situation like Los Angeles, I'm just guessing it would be. I've been out there in Agora Hills, and I have a friend who kept a beehive in his backyard, and his bees did not make it. There just wasn't enough forage around for them. But a lot of the bees in the city do really well. Here's the thing. Me personally, I would check in with my immediate neighbors. If you have people living very close by to you, it is worth checking with them to find out, is anybody allergic? If anything ever happens with that, you're going to be blamed, period. Even though bees can come from everywhere, they fly for miles, they forage everywhere, they could be anyone's bees. The fact that you keep a hive and that you're in the neighborhood and that a child right next door got stung, had an anaphylactic shock situation, worst case scenario, you get blamed. There was a case in Missouri, Kirkwood, Missouri, where a beekeeper was successfully sued because he owned bees, and on his same block somebody was stung and had an allergic reaction. So be very aware of who's immediate to you, and make sure you have a stockade fence or some kind of privacy fence so the bees are forced to fly up and over and not directly through a child's play area. Also check on local ordinances to make sure that you're permitted to keep bees, and check in with the Beekeepers Association in your area. I'm sure Los Angeles has beekeepers associations. You can find out what kind of issues they're having, and they will be able to really guide you. Maybe have somebody come out and look at your backyard with you, or your rooftop, or wherever you're planning to do it, and help you come up with some ideas on how to orient the hive and position the hive so you can still access it, care for your bees, and that they'll have a nice flyway that does not involve getting into a child's play area, for example. But that's something that we always have to be aware of, and pick a type of bee that is not very angsty. You don't want a bunch of hot bees around a residential area where on one of those days when they're feeling a little cranky, that they would go after people for little or no provocation at all, including dogs and things like that. So it really has to do with who's immediately around your property and what the regulations are where you live. The next question is Patriot Homestead. If you split a hive, how far away from the original hive must you place the split? Okay, here's the thing. A lot of people do splits a lot of different ways. I do splits very casually. I just find when I have a hive that's really building up, and I don't want to stack 5 or 6 boxes on a hive and just let it continue to grow through the year, I like to split them off when I see a big population. And when you get down to those brood boxes and you've got a couple of frames, couple of boxes that are full of brood, and the resources, the honey and pollen and everything is packed around the outside of those frames, then it's time to do a split. The way I do a split, I just set my boxes right next to it. I use the Be Smart Design hive stand, and I set that there with all the new equipment, and I just transfer the frames that I want into that. And now that we have those new synthetic drawn out comb frames that come from Better Bee that I spoke about last FAQ, Now that I have those, the outside 2 frames at each end, so if it's a 10-frame box, 4 of those frames are going to be pre-drawn synthetic comb, because when you do a split, one of the toughest things for the bees is that they have to draw new comb. So then we're going to put in capped brood. Then we're going to take the frames, we're going to shake the nurse bees off in there, a bunch of them, and then we're going to have some open brood too. Because if we make a mistake and we don't move the queen with them, or if we leave the queen behind, we take the queen with us, both hives need to have open brood so they can develop and replace the queen if they've lost her. So the other thing is, and I know that's not the question, but I'm just throwing that in there for those that are thinking about doing a split. Walk-away splits are, of course, you do the split, you have open brood in both, and you don't care where the queen was, and you just let them take off on their own. I put those sometimes just 2 boxes away, so that they're literally 4 feet apart. Now what happens? The older bees that are in there, the foraging bees, will return to the original box. So, and that's not a problem because you've put capped brood in there, those are going to hatch out, and you've got some resources. You need to also transfer at least a frame of honey, and you need to transfer a frame of pollen, and you need to put a feeder on it when you make a new split. So I don't take them far at all. I leave them right. I've not had one fail, and I put them just a couple boxes apart. The farthest ones are like 40, 50 feet apart. If I'm getting rid of old bee equipment and I want to sell off a colony of bees, I'll make the split and use old equipment and put the split all in stuff in there and sell that to a new beekeeper. And then that lets me rotate in new equipment. But as far as the distance, for me, it doesn't matter. Of course, if you can haul them away several miles, if you've got another out yard somewhere where you're going to keep bees, and you do a split and you put a bunch of workers and everything in there, and then you haul it 6 miles away and put them in a field or next to a barn or something like that, those foragers are going to reorient themselves, and they're going to continue to go back to that box because they're frankly just too far and unfamiliar with the terrain to get back to their original hive. So, thanks for those questions. Have a great weekend. If you have questions yourself, please feel free to write them down in the comments section, and we'll look at those for next Friday. Sorry, I'm in kind of a hurry today. I have to go off and do some photography this afternoon in this heat, and it deals with a forensics lab, so that should be cool. Have fun with your bees. Let us know if you have questions. If you'd like to share some things about your own bees, feel free to use the comment section to do that. And try to stay cool. Lots of water. Don't forget to make mineral water available. A teaspoon of sea salts per quart. Free choice, away from the hives. Fresh water that is not city water. Bees avoid city water. So fresh water that's distilled, for example. And you should be good to go. Provide your bees with some shade. Happy beekeeping. Thanks for watching.